words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Good morning again. And it's a delight to be here with you. And I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart as a priest and a wife for the prayers and the love that you lavish on my husband, Padre Warren. So grateful. It's, as many of you know, from times that you've been sick or in need of extra prayers, you can feel them, right? You know that that community is there praying for you and caring about you, and it really makes a big difference. So thank you. Thank you very much for that. I want us to talk about the gospel, but I'm going to get there by way of Esther. Because I think with everything that's been going on this week, it's like a boon to have this feisty woman story in the book of Esther, a book named for a woman in the canonical Bible, which is a plus too. And she's actually the woman who speaks. She's the fourth in order of how many words she actually speaks in the Bible. A fellow priest, Lindsay Freeman, did a study of this with some people from her congregation, and wrote a book called Bible Women, Their Words and Why They Matter. And she actually counted all the words that different women named and unnamed in the Bible speak, and Esther's number 4. She has the fourth number of words. So we hear some of them today. But Esther, as you may know, the story of Esther is connected to a Jewish festival of Purim. And you can hear this actually in the end of the reading that we had, where Mordecai is sending out this notice that this feast is to be celebrated forever after. Has anybody ever been to a Purim celebration in a synagogue? I haven't either, but it sounds like a blast, and I want to go someday. They read the story, and it's kind of like audience participation, almost like Rocky Horror Picture Show or something. So when the villain, Haman, when his name is mentioned, the kids especially have noisemakers, and they stamp their feet, and they hiss, because he's clearly the bad guy. And they dress up in costumes, and they have special foods, and it's kind of like a carnival atmosphere, and it comes in the spring, usually in February or March. So Purim celebrates this overthrow of the wicked Haman, who's this kind of classic villain. And we just hear the very end of the story in our reading today, so I want to give you a little background. It takes place about 4 centuries before Christ in ancient Persia. And so the Jewish people are oppressed, as they are through a lot of their history, this time by the Persian Empire. And what we don't hear about in the story is the king's first wife, and her name is Vashti. And he is having a huge feast of about 187 days of feasting, they say. And at the end of this, he and his friends, his nobles, are merry with wine, they say in the text. And he summons Queen Vashti to come wearing her crown and to show her beauty to all of these men. And Vashti says, no thank you, and doesn't go. And for this insubordination, she is dethroned. We don't know what happens to her, something worse than that perhaps, but she disappears from the story. And the king is in the market then for a new wife. And he does this in a very sort of fairy tale way. I always think this story reminds me of Cinderella in some ways, but it's really that Cinderella reminds us of it, because it's older. Sort of a beauty pageant to see the most beautiful girl in the land who's going to be the new queen. And Esther is taken into the king's harem, and his favor falls upon her, and she's the one. So her uncle, sort of uncle, Mordecai, who's kind of her surrogate father, has raised her. She was orphaned. He says, don't say anything about where you come from. Don't tell him that you're from the people of Israel. But who knows that maybe your place in the royal household might be fortuitous. You may be there for just such a time as this. Because it turns out Haman, who, as I say, is kind of this stereotypical villain, conspires because he doesn't like Mordecai. He decides he wants to get rid of all the Jews in the empire. And so he sends out this edict that they should all be killed. So this goes out throughout the land. And Mordecai finds out about this and lets Esther know and says, you've got to do something. So she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And they come, and the king says, what do you want? I'll give you anything you want, even half my kingdom. It's reminiscent of Herod later in the New Testament, right? She says, I just want you to come to another banquet. So she's kind of biding her time. She doesn't want to make the request right off the bat. And so they come to the second banquet, and this is where it reminds me of Cinderella, because it's like the knights of the ball. It's like building up to this kind of climax. And so finally the king says, okay, what do you want? And she says, this is what we heard today, I want to save my people. I want to save myself and my people because someone has conspired to kill them. And the king says, who is this? And she says, it's Haman. It's this wicked Haman. And so the king ends up hanging him on the very gallows, the scaffolding that he had intended to hang Mordecai on. He's hoisted by his own petard, you might say. And Esther triumphs. She saves her people. She saves herself. She's a heroine. I think I first heard her name probably in that song in Fiddler on the Roof, Sunset, the Sabbath song, where they're blessing the daughters. Do y'all know this movie? I love Fiddler on the Roof so much. Anyway, may you be like Ruth and like Esther. May you be deserving of praise. So Esther is a heroine, goes down in Jewish history. And so they celebrate this overturning, right? Everything looked terrible. It looked like very bad, that people were going to be killed. But in fact, the villain, the one who conspired to do this, is the one who is killed. So it's this kind of topsy-turvy overturning of everything that's, who's in power. And I love this line from an article I read about Purim. The loftiest and most crucial issues of identity and survival are in constant tension with a farcical lightness and comic exaggeration. So there's a lot of humor in it, even though it's dealing with these very kind of difficult and stark realities of this people living in oppression. There's this kind of gallows humor, we could say, that runs through the text of Esther and that runs through the celebration of Purim, and we could even say that runs through Jewish history and through the Jewish approach to the Bible. And that's something that we have inherited, and that I think a lot of times is lost on us. So that we read these stories or these parables or these teachings from the New Testament straight, and really they would have been greeted with like outrageous laughter, because a lot of times they're so absurd. And that's how it is with our gospel today, I believe. Jesus is teaching. He's clearly impassioned, this kind of grotesque almost imagery about the hand and the foot and the eye. But it's outrageous, outsized, kind of, it's there to shock and to get people's attention, and I think also to get this kind of gallows humor going, where people would have been cracking up as he was saying this. We don't hear it that way today, but I really think that's how it was. Especially the millstone, right? Anybody seen a millstone? Big, right? Not like hanging something around your neck, even something very heavy that might drag you down to the bottom of the sea. But I had one in my yard in Massachusetts. It was like as wide as this, big. So how could that be hung around your neck? Imagine hearing that. It would be better for you if a millstone was hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. It's absurd. It's outrageous. So it would have provoked this kind of shocked and strange laughter. And so I think if we're open to that spirit in some of the things that we hear in the New Testament, we're more able to hear the meaning, the deeper meaning, all the levels of meaning that are there. Because this is another inheritance from our Jewish roots, right? Is that the rabbis interpreted the text at different levels. There was the surface level, the literal level, kind of the plain sense of the text. Then under that, maybe a kind of allegorical level, where something stands for something else, like a metaphor or a simile. Under that, a moral level, where the text or the passage gives us instruction for our lives. We might call that a homiletical level. What we talk about in a sermon is often at that level. And then even deeper than that, a spiritual or mystical level about how we can interpret this text in our lives, in our souls, what it has to say to us in our journey with God. So I thought it'd be fun to look at this, at the gospel, at those 4 levels and see what we could come up with. And I'm just talking right now specifically about Jesus saying, if your hand offends you, cut it off. If your foot offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, tear it out. It would be better to get into the kingdom of God maimed than to not get there at all. So the literal sense is pretty gruesome, right? Pretty grotesque. This visceral kind of image. But we know in medicine that sometimes something like that is necessary, right? If you have skin cancer or you have something, sometimes your body literally needs to have something taken out that is threatening it, that will otherwise hasten your end if you don't do that kind of drastic measure. In medical history, we see more extreme examples of that. As medicine progresses, it gets more and more likely that we can preserve parts of ourselves and care for them while they're still part of us than just taking it off. But so that's the literal or plain sense of what Jesus is saying. So then what about the allegorical sense? If you were to think of this in a more metaphorical way, what comes to mind?
If you steal something, you can't come up.
Right, that there was that, and still sometimes some places today, a kind of penal code of punishment for using your hand for something wrong. I've seen parents slap their kid's hand in that same way if you reach for something that's hot. There's some other allegorical, kind of metaphorical ways we could think of this passage.
The guy that was trapped in out in the southwest that was hiking, got trapped, and his arm got trapped, and he cut it off.
Right, that 27 hours, was that the movie that was, yeah, right. He literally had to sacrifice his arm in order to save his life, right? Well, the body is often used as a metaphor for the community, right? We hear this in St. Paul, right? We are one body in Christ, and the body has many members. Paul even says something like, the eye does not say to the hand, I do not need you. So it almost sounds like an antidote kind of to Jesus' teaching in a way. But so we could interpret this to mean something like that. If there's someone or something in the community that is steering us in the wrong path or causing irreparable harm, then it'd be better for that part to be cut out. But then that can get us into trouble, right? Because who's doing the deciding about what the bad element is, and who's doing the deciding about what's going to befall that person? It's kind of like Queen Vashti. So then there's the deeper level, the moral level. And this might be an opportunity to think about what Jesus is trying to get at with his disciples. He's basically encouraging them not to be stumbling blocks or traps. The Greek word is connected to our word scandal, to be a scandal to others, to offend them, but it's part of a way of catching something. It's like the little stick that gets kicked out so that something is trapped. That's what the root of that word is. So it's like, don't trip somebody up who's trying to be on the path. And that can apply to a community, a family, a congregation. It can also be a kind of bigger sense of that in terms of society. Like, what are the things in our society that keep us from wholeness, that keep us from being the beloved community? I think of some of those isms, like racism or sexism or heterosexism, the ways that we judge and label other people and keep ourselves distant from them. At St. Martin's, where I serve in Williamsburg, today is Youth Sunday, and one of our young people, Maddie, is giving a homily, and I got to see it ahead of time since I wasn't going to be there to hear it. And she does a beautiful job of breaking open this passage along those lines and encouraging the congregation to think about what are the ways that we in our society kind of separate ourselves from one another, and what do we need to get rid of, to pluck out, to cut off in our societal way of thinking, so that we can be closer to the way God intends us to be. She says the ways we judge each other, the ways, our ignorance, our divisiveness that keep us from loving the way Christ loves us. So finally then, there's the mystical level, the spiritual level. Mystical is a word that often kind of frightens people because it sounds like woo, but really it's just experiencing God. That's what mysticism is, direct experience of God. So that means introspection, right? What are the things in our hearts that keep us from full communion with other people? And what might we need to pluck out or cut off in the ways that we see or hear or judge or separate ourselves from other people and from God? What's the pruning that we might need to do as people of God that will help us connect? So last image that I want you to play around with a little bit is that one at the end about salt, right? Salt, everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but what if it's lost its saltiness? In the ancient world, salt was used as it is today as a seasoning, but also as a preservative, right? Salt kept things from spoiling. But if it loses that quality, let's say if we as the church lose our saltiness, our ability to speak out about the things in our world that are not right with God, then what's going to happen? How will those things, those sacred things, be preserved that need to be preserved? We need to keep our own saltiness as Christians, so that we can still, as James says, be at peace with one another, but also have that ability to preserve and to flavor our world in a particular way. I love this line from Martin Luther King about the church is not supposed to be a thermometer that just shows the temperature of what's going on in the world. It's supposed to be a thermostat that sets the temperature, that sets out what needs to be the case in terms of how people are treated and respected and seen as made in the image of God. That's part of what we're about. So at the end of our prayers, I'm going to invite us to a litany of prayer for our country in this week of tumultuousness that reveals our divisions, reveals in a lot of ways how far we still have to go. But with grace and trust in God, we will get there. May it be so.